Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. I'll try to maintain the high level of presentation with our previous speaker. You should put me first next time. But I will also take some of the issues that Khalid presented, maybe step back a little bit and look at the stages of evolution of the UAE city and its attempt to create an image for the future, how to project into the future, that sometimes these master plans are not always implemented, and there are moments and spaces, moments in time and spaces where the plan and the master plan doesn't work, and those are the moments that I'm quite interested to kind of revisit and look at opportunities and how the current state of culture, technological and planning ideas and the change of these ideas have affected the projection of the image of the city. Let me just... So, this is maybe an image that represents some of the conceptual ideas that I like to talk about today. It's one of my favorite images. I think it was taken, it's a photograph taken maybe sometime in the 1960s in Abu Dhabi. And is this a perfect setting of the first phase of my presentation, which is the traditional settlements, temporary structures, the kind of settlements along the coast in this case, no infrastructure and so on. And then there's the first notion of modernity with a highway or a kind of road that tries to survive amidst the in the middle of this shifting landscape. And this moment between tradition and the projection of modernity and the little thresholds in between, I think are quite fascinating. The typical, and I think Khalid shows some images of how the city developed traditionally up until 1960s, and that 1960 I think was a key moment in the change of the GCC and the UAE city, because from this settlement of the sporadic, unplanned, if you like, placement of family houses, one move abruptly into a master plan. Some of my, again, favorite images here, which I think are kind of symbolic and key moments in the history. This is of the city. This is architect and planner Makhlouf. And sitting on the ground with His Highness Sheikh Zayed, pointing at the future plan of Abu Dhabi. But the plan is very Western. It's based on a grid. Makhlouf studied, he's from Egypt originally, but he studied in Germany. So all of a sudden now the master plan of the UAE city in 1960s has this Western influence of the grid, the high-rise, the infrastructure, and so on. And you can see the plan of Abu Dhabi through the infilling of the spaces in between and so on, but still the grid retain its original autonomy. In a similar way, in Dubai, this is a photograph maybe in the first 1 or 2 decades of the 20th century as a small fishing village, of course. And this is a drawing that I came up recently, which is a sketch done by a British architect by the name of John Harris, who was the master planner of Dubai. And it's exactly how the city, in this little scribble and this little sketch, one can see how the city was prepared to project itself in the future with a series of lines, with these rough pencil lines drawn on almost on a white piece of paper, which is the desert in this case, but taking the city, projecting the city outside from the center outside onto the desert. And this is then the famous 1959 plan by John Harris. I did a number of years ago my research on his work. At the time, he was a young graduate from London, and he was appointed by Sheikh Rashid to draw the master plan of Dubai. And you can see the old part of the city and the creek on the top left. And then he projected, rather than doing a series of zoning and land use approach, he just drew a series of lines based on certain grids, but he took the density and the morphology of the old city and then of the old town, and then projected that out onto the desert, anticipating the arrival of a large number of immigration and so on in the city in 1959. On the middle, somewhere in the middle there, you see Karama, and maybe it's you can see even nowadays the urban block in Karama, how it was planned at that time. There was no interest to look at the coastline because it was not about tourism and resorts. It was more about expanding the city inwards along the creek. So a number of years ago, many years ago, I should say, I started editing a book by Thames and Hudson on the evolution of the UAE city, and we had a chance to get some of these archive photographs from the office of John Harris. This is another of my favorite images, and the detail is very important here. On the left-hand side, Sheikh Rashid, the father of Sheikh Mohammed. On his side, the architect, John Harris, and then the two advisors, smoking and drinking coffee, and the ruler points at an architectural drawing, which is quite complex. It's an architectural sections. Architectural sections are very complex drawings because only architects apparently can read. And here's the ruler pointing on a high-rise building with the architect and discussing the future of this apparently building, which of course that building was the World Trade Center, which was finished in '78 in the middle of nowhere. Sheikh Rashid had this vision to take the center of the city outside the fishing town, establishing a new highway towards Abu Dhabi and the west. And it was also based on the New York World Trade Center of a high-rise of offices, a hotel, and an expo center. And you can still see some of these buildings on site today. But the strange thing is that this high-rise was in the middle of nowhere. This is another of the photographs that we got from John Harris's office, which kind of reminds you, and again, this amazing contradiction or lack of connection between the beautiful landscape of Dubai at the time and a modernist concrete building in 1978. And even more, the building was in the middle of nowhere. So this idea of projecting an image of the city, of the highest tower in the Middle East at the time, away from the city, kind of creating and anticipating the expansion, I think is quite visionary and quite daring as well. In a similar way, this is in Doha, 1960s, the Sheraton Hotel, and that also takes me to the other issue. I'd like to briefly mention the idea of the monument and the isolated building. It's a hotel. We can say it's almost like infrastructural. This is the construction of Sheraton Hotel in Doha. Nowadays, you don't recognize this area, of course, very much because it's almost like downtown and so on. But this vision of creating this mirage of a skeletal building, I think, in the middle of an empty land is quite visionary and daring as well. And then a number of years ago, as you were driving around the outskirts of Dubai, and this is a picture I took, this was a billboard of a hotel, almost like a full-scale billboard of a hotel, which was never realized. It was called Asia. But prior to constructing the building, there was a billboard to it. And this notion of kind of projecting the image of the city through the imagery of what is to become, even though it never became, it almost became virtual and so on, it's also quite fascinating. Not dissimilar, and that's another picture, long before the Jumeirah Beach residence was built, you could see not so much a science fiction image of the city, but a kind of real rendering of what the city was going to be in the form of a billboard. Again, the city projecting an image of itself prior to its construction. But the fact that the building was not built at the time kind of creates this interesting connection between the vision and reality to become. So on one hand, one was projecting these images and visions of the future, which was visible and was iconic and so on. On the other side, there was this incredible infrastructure thing that took place, and that's also fascinating. This is Jebel Ali port, huge, and this is, I think this picture was taken maybe a decade ago. The city built itself on the infrastructure, on production, on consumption, and so on. And that's also another way, I think, of taking some clues about the projection of the city in the future. A number of years ago, some of my students at the American University of Sharjah in the School of Architecture, we went back into the city and we tried to map the casual encounters, finding ways or mapping how people behave. In this case, I had a student who was mapping overall in this project areas of heat in the city, which indicates some form of activity and so on. It's almost like beginning to fill in the gaps of the master plan in a city which is hyperactive and it's about infrastructure and production. And we've also been looking at the kind of the flip side of the backyards and so on as another form of urbanism. And at that time, we started intersecting little, almost like interventions and connections and little elements and acupunctures into the city, creating almost like these abstract diagrams of how we can intensify the city in a kind of informal, almost like invisible way, just taking the little leftovers from the street and try to compose them into a bigger kind of dynamic diagram. More recently, I was looking at the landscape abandoned spaces in the city, what Gilles Clement, a French biologist, gardener, is talking the third landscape, which is interesting. Third landscapes are places in the city or outside the city that are left empty and abandoned because they have no real estate value. And because of that abandonedness, as he describes the third landscape, they create their own indigenous, natural condition, which is almost unique. So the fact that a site is not developed by default and through years gains its own value. And I think it's quite fascinating. And this one is the aerial map of the industrial area in Sharjah. And what you see here is the junkyards and the engine yards and the warehouses and the workshops which are left abandoned. That's another side of interventions that I had with my students. So in a way, it's the flip side of the master plan, has its own value. As opposed to a master plan, and this is a survey drawing of the palm, Jumeirah palm, where everything is well articulated. Everything has a plot boundary, obviously has a plot value. Everything is efficient, there's highways. And as Rem Koolhaas mentioned once when he visited the UAE, in the 19th century, you had a small garden in front of your house. It's like a little defensive space between the house and the street. In the 20th century, in suburban America, you have a back garden and you have a swimming pool at the back. In the 21st century, not only have a small garden in the front, not only have a swimming pool in the back, but you have also the ocean in your back as well. So you have another water at the back of your property, and it all goes back to this notion of property and so on. So the notion of the Gulf futurism is interesting, it's a term created maybe 10 years ago, which has to do with the notion of the kind of postmodern, luxurious, sometimes utopian, technological aesthetic in art and design in the Gulf. And it's a term, I think, which is kind of great interest, I think, because one begins to talk almost like the notion of aesthetics and how do you create this postmodernity of form and cultural and technological interface in the Gulf. This is slightly relating to that. This is Kuwait and this notion of the iconic water towers in Kuwait, which are painted in a specific way and so on. But not maybe dissimilar to this, I think, interesting collage of the 3 stages, but they all put together in a kind of the perspectival framing of a view. In the foreground, the Orientalist image, which was created in the 19th century in Europe, which is very controversial. If you read some of the writings of Said, of the kind of domination of Europe onto the Middle East, of representing Middle Eastern people as kind of lazy, hanging around and not doing anything, and there's all these kind of stereotypical motifs, which now the UAE city is using almost to promote or reinvent its own identity. And in the middle perspectival space here, you have Medina Jumeirah, which is the fake reconstruction, if you like, of history. And then in the back, you have the high-tech Teflon material, Burj Al Arab, and so on, which is a reminder of the future and so on. So always this kind of clash of perceptions and stages and periods, but they're kind of put together as a hybrid aggregation of what the city is prepared to present itself. And of course, a more contemporary, imaginary rendering of the hyper, super luxurious, utopian, everything goes, artificial intelligence produce images of the utopian image of the city, which is not so far away from the reality of the city. It's not mentioned that this is Dubai, but obviously it is the kind of virtual projection of maybe how the city will look in the future. Talking about the utopian and the projection, and we've been looking with my students at the American University of Sharjah in the fifth year studio in this case, ways to recreate this kind of Gulf futurism and trying to find a way to represent and design and project and challenge in a little utopian way the city. And we're moving from planning to materiality and looking at environment and climate, not in a naive way of having buildings with grass on the top and so on, and talk about sustainability in this way, but take the indigenous climate and ecologies of the region and project that into a future using technology and simulation tools and so on. In this case, we're designing these towers for farming, for storing water, and dealing with the agriculture of a space. So the student and myself go crazy sometimes dealing with this kind of complexity of an adobe building, collecting water, preserving humidity, and so on, as one way to test a possible scenario for the future. And in the same way, this is the town called Jazira al-Hamra, which is this abandoned town in Ras Al Khaimah. And rather than and the town now, it seems that the authorities want to convert that into another thematic museum by reconstructing some of the buildings and so on. We decided to do exactly the opposite, to leave the buildings in their eroded current condition and bring this series of temporary machines, agriculture machines, to turn the city into another garden and so on, as one way to injecting new life into these buildings. So you see the plan of the town in the background, if you like, and this kind of this agriculture fields. They kind of bring in the notion of the garden back into the city. In a similar way, looking at the more archaic condition of landscape, collecting water again, gardening, and so on. And in another case, in an intentionally very abstract way, a student here is taking the marshlands of a site in the region and looking at ways where the kind of solid, the water condition, the shifting ground, and so on creates a kind of natural habitat for natural life and inhabitation. And in a similar way, the notion of constructing a kind of tectonic, modernist, cantilever type of housing with also nature as comes into these, again, imaginary representations. Usually the sky is a little bit dark and the land is very barren and so on. This is not a rendering. This is a drawing. It's a photograph by some of our graduates, ex-architects. They have been my students, and a number of years ago, I think 2018, they won one of the Aga Khan Awards in the region by designing this natural visitor center in Wasit, which is a wetland project outside the Sharjah, and this kind of beautiful, I think quite utopian project having this long linear axis, which are kind of submerged into the ground as one way to integrate the building with the landscape and make a minimum impact on the migrating birds. That project won one of the Aga Khan Award that time, which is great to see that. And then in our labs, we do these strange things of drawing with sand, for example. This is Tallinn, who is a very established artist currently, injecting silicone and other adhesives into sand, not knowing exactly what she's doing. Very scary to have a robot operating in the same room. And what she started doing, kind of casting these beautiful kind of creatures, formless to some extent, but somehow they have a rigidity which is kind of important in architecture, because all of a sudden there's a kind of rigid formwork and so on. And then projects develop, it's a different student in this case, where we're using sand as a temporary formwork technique. And some of these can become quite stable. These are maybe half a meter models. And the whole idea is to create this structure where another material can cast and it be casted and so on. So then the sun is returned back into the landscape as well. Kind of a bit strange and weird projects, but technologically possible. And this is a drawing of the same project where we propose this form of temporary inhabitation using this very primitive cave-like condition of casting and forming a space into the desert. Also use some other tools, quite high-tech digital tools. This is a 3D model of something that which kind of formalizes sand in this case, but without affecting or disturbing, if you like, its natural condition. Very similar to the whole idea of dealing with the landscape as a new master plan, as a kind of infrastructure in the desert, let's say in suburbia and outside the center of the cities. Another student here who is kind of creating this endless repetitive space by using salt and casting salt. So this is another, we managed to simulate the crystallization of material, which is salt, and how it can grow as a crystal. And in this case, kind of simulating. Again, it's a proposal which is kind of temporary to some extent and may not survive time. But at least there's an intention to kind of go back to the roots of the barren landscape and the empty land, to not impose a series of new development, but kind of grow the space from within. Not very dissimilar. Interesting work recently by Rem Koolhaas talking about the hospital of the future, which is kind of this raw, uninteresting warehouse, if you like, architecture with natural conditions and so on. And also this one, it's almost like endless gardens of infrastructure and growing plants and so on. Again, under the theme of projecting an image of the future. And so in that sense, another work of kind of intentionally using an aesthetic, which is, this is a project done in the outskirts of Alcúz, kind of recycling the industrial leftover materiality of the city. This is a series of gardens and kitchens and restaurants, which has to do with, again, the notion of ecology and sustainability and recycling natural resources. And then the interior, like Rem Koolhaas one, has this kind of modernist projection of the walkway and the grid and the overgrown. And you're not quite sure if it's a new building or a building which is falling apart. It's kind of it's quite utopian or dystopian in that sense, which is also something that we're quite interested, I think, as one condition of the future. So we are projects carry on. This is another student who is recasting the aluminum from second-hand cars in Dubai, and he managed to cast the whole aluminum, but also simulate that into little shelters in the industrial area of Dubai. And then finally, coming back to the idea of the master plan, where in this case, incomplete projects in the city some time ago are superimposed with infrastructure, which again is an incomplete condition. And again, the master plan, which was never realized, but the building, which was never built, kind of come together, not as a means to an end, but as one seat to look at possibilities of the future. And in a similar way, the kind of simulations of the landscape come back, it's almost like these decorative motifs come back into the industrial part of the city, almost like the early billboard, but horizontally, trying to intensify and overlap and look at the empty plots of the third landscape and so on. Maybe create spaces of art, spaces of gatherings, spanning across empty plots and so on. And maybe the idea of allowing these structures, not physically to grow, but allowed to introduce another dimension, I think, into the missing condition of the master plan. This again in Al Quoz in Dubai. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It again was a super great presentation, and the photos and materials you shared with us, it's just something very unique and impressive. Again, only 5 minutes. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Seems like I always have something to say. George, thank you very much once again. And for me, I was listening to this presentation for the second time already, because there was also the first time when we were discussing it. And since that moment, I was saving this question for you, like from this like a little bit crazy futuristic projects, which one would you personally really want to see light in real life?
You mean...
like your students' work.
Of the student,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, this is a little bit of some samples of the work, obviously. I think the notion of, we kind of go on the outskirts, like suburbia is the new center, and I didn't talk about the agoraphobia, the fear of the center, and some of these projects were developed after COVID, and the notion that everybody left the city, and, you know, Khalid showed these amazing photographs of the sikas in downtown and so on, which nobody uses anymore, and even now. So the idea of going to the outskirts is interesting. Maybe the desert, because then we can talk about materiality in this case. And then, so some of the projects, they're not meant to be only towers or objects, the projects, but more like an infrastructure. And the notion of infrastructure interests me. I think the project with the salt, it came in collaboration with the UAE team for the Venice Biennale. We had some collaboration with Vale at the time, and they used salt in the project. For me, it's interesting because it kind of created not an object-like of building, but it's more like a field where a certain type of inhabitation can happen. So maybe I'm attracted to projects which are not addressing the reality or the structure of architecture to some extent, because those become more provocative. I think in a similar way, like the early utopian master plans, I think of building, like the early black and white photographs of building kind of objects that don't belong to the landscape, but there's a vision of something great to happen. So it's not about the object so much, it's about what that object did to the city, whether it's the master plan of Abu Dhabi or the master plan of Dubai. So I think generally I'm interested in the impossible projects of the non-figurative, if you like, and more to do with a kind of abstract diagrammatic pattern of a land development.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel you completely. I was super impressed by the project with the desert inhabited, if I understood it right. Like these, it's sort of climate ecological idea, but at the same time very futuristic and with the artistic approach. So I'm truly impressed by the presentation.
Is that the one with the desert?
With the holes.
With a hole.
Yeah.
That was done by a Saudi student. And when I asked her, well, I mean, obviously I'm impressed, but you know, he said to me, Professor, my grandfather grew up in this landscape. He came from somewhere in Saudi, and in a way, there was part of the subconscious way, I think, of thinking of the student to go back into the roots of the land, but also the family back into
And
that.
also it's a form of commemoration and a memory, I guess, of like family and stuff. Okay. Any other questions? You? Sure.
So it was super interesting. Thank you so much. And I was thinking during your talk about my drive here to this library when I was looking at all these big skyscrapers. And as like a mere mortal, I just don't understand how they can be built, like, you know, what's the technology behind that. But now when we see this even more futuristic, city landscapes that you represented here, like my interest is like, how can we produce forms like that? What's the technology behind that? Because it looks like we are going to 3D print the whole cities. Like, what's your prediction for that?
Yes, yeah, I mean, and as I said, the shifting from the master plan to physicality or materiality, it's kind of intentional here, because I think the region has so much potential. I mean, natural found conditions, or natural found materials and so on, such as sand, rock, casting, which we use quite a lot and so on. Obviously, there's a challenge because it's not part of the practice of construction yet. You know, you don't find a contractor to do these things overnight. They know how to work in a different way. So it will, but the whole notion of designing with nature, I don't want to be too romantic here, or we build like nature and so on, but going back to the land as a form of inspiration and a source of inspiration, I think is very challenging to some extent. Again, not dissimilar to the visionary ideas of the 1960s, as much as those were also controversial at the time and so on. I think in terms of the possibilities structurally, and in terms of construction, is possible. I mean, you mentioned 3D printing. One doesn't want to make buildings that look organic, and I intentionally, for myself, I avoided using the word organic because I don't think it's appropriate. This is the favorite word of the students. Oh, professor, I want to do something organic. I said, no, don't do organic. Do something tectonic and spacious and so on. But I think it's happening, maybe at the scale of small installations right now, like 3D printing, reusing or recycling materials and so on. In a lot of the projects, not so much the building form itself and material, but it's what you find from nature. So it's all about agriculture and watering or collecting water, for example, allowing metal to rust and so on. It's a little bit of the romantic of the ruin and so on. So I think it's possible for that to happen. I'm not quite sure the value in kind of real estate and construction in that sense, which maybe you're referring to, but I think it's a challenge to look at other forms of materiality, which also comes from the region itself and maybe from the practice of craftsmanship of the region as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.